Today, we're diving into the TikTok girlies' favorite new trend, cycle syncing. Cycle syncing refers to timing your exercise and movement around your current phase of your menstrual cycle. And while I do think that there is some good to come out of this trend, there's also a lot just to break down. Specifically in today's video, we'll discuss the basic outline of cycle syncing, what the studies say, and then my opinion. But first, we should probably break down the menstrual cycle itself. Menstrual cycle is typically thought of in 4 phases, so let's quickly break down each one. First is menstruation. Menstruation is the period part of your cycle. So this is where the uterus lining sheds, which is your period, and this phase typically lasts 3 to 7 days. Next is the follicular phase. This starts on the first day of your period, so technically menstruation is kind of like a sub-phase, if you will, and this lasts for 13 to 14 days until ovulation. This is when you basically create an egg. After that comes ovulation. This is where the egg leaves the ovaries and goes through the fallopian tubes to the uterus. This phase lasts about 16 to 32 hours. And finally, the luteal phase. This is where the cells in the ovaries release some hormones that help thicken the uterine wall in preparation for pregnancy. If the egg is fertilized, you're starting to grow something. And if not, then the uterus lining sheds and we start back at menstruation. All right, now that you understand the very, very basics of the menstrual cycle, let's break down what the fitness girlies are saying. Okay, so I'm gonna pop up this very Pinterest-esque graphic, which is honestly like the way you see most of this information put out there. And although you might see small variations in recommendations, this is pretty much what I see across the board. So we'll start in the menstrual phase. This is where you're on your period. And during this phase, you can go walking, you can do foam rolling, you can do yin yoga and mat Pilates. So it seems like it's very gentle, low impact type of movement, which makes sense. Usually in this part of your phase is where you're gonna have like cramping and things. So you might not be super comfortable doing other forms of movement. Then we've got the follicular phase. So this is where you are allowed to go swimming, running, doing cardio, and power vinyasa. So this phase seems a little bit more cardio heavy. Then we've got ovulation. So you can go cycling, do cardio, do HIIT, CrossFit, and boot camp. This, again, seems pretty cardio heavy. And then finally, we have the luteal phase where you can do strength training, low incline walking, yoga, bar, and Pilates. I want to point out really quickly, before I give any opinions, this is the only phase that you're supposed to strength train in. We'll leave it at that for now. Okay, so I put this on a calendar based off of the typical 28-day cycle that most people have. I know that that's not 100% across the board, but that is like the typical average length of a full cycle of all 4 phases. Okay, so we understand what the menstrual cycle is. We understand what is being recommended. Now let's move on to what the studies say. I'm not gonna lie to you. I had a hard time finding studies on this. I mean, there are, like, you gotta dig, and there are some studies. There's actually just a lot more evidence and research of cycling your nutrition with your cycle than movement. And honestly, a lot of that is just down to the fact that we haven't studied exercise science for that long, and we also haven't studied women for that long. Now, all that being said, there were a few studies that I found. There was one from pretty recently, 2022, that actually contradicted a lot of the recommendations that I've seen online, which is interesting. Studies demonstrate that anaerobic capacity and muscle strength are greatest during the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle when estrogen levels peak. So anaerobic activity, I feel like I made a video on this, maybe, Justina? This gets a little complicated to explain without going into like ATP and how our body uses energy. So we can just talk about like different types of training. Essentially, anaerobic activity does not require oxygen to create energy or ATP, and aerobic activity does. Examples of aerobic activity would be like, you know, running, swimming, different cardio movements that don't have a lot of rest time. So think more endurance, right? Anaerobic activity does not need oxygen to produce energy. So you're using stored energy to complete the movement. So this is typically going to be things like strength training, but also things like sprinting or different types of interval training, because you're not going to be in that cardiovascular state as long as someone who's going like on a 2-mile run, right? So if you do like a 10-second sprint, that actually is still an anaerobic activity. So the things that are being recommended in the follicular phase are running, cardio, power vinyasa, swimming. Those are all aerobic activities. So I think that's interesting. In addition, studies indicate that resistance training conducted in the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle, follicular phase-based resistance training, may be superior to luteal phase-based training. This is really hard to read. in terms of enhancing muscle strength and mass. This raises the possibility that the physiological capacities of skeletal muscle to adapt to exercise training are dependent on the menstrual cycle and can be important for female athletes in optimizing their training. So I wanted to read that whole phrase because I think it's important to note that at the very end, they say, this is important for athletes to note to optimize their training. This isn't, hey, we think every person needs to live this way, right? I actually made a video about how much I hate this like optimizing your workout trend because it really doesn't take into account what you enjoy, what your goals are, what your time commitment is, what you have access to. So I think if anything, this study, I don't really even care so much about them being like, well, actually, you should strength train at the follicular phase rather than the luteal phase because of this and that. I don't really actually care about any of that because this study is about female athletes. Another study noted endurance performance may only be improved in the mid-luteal phase compared with the early follicular phase. So again, it's kind of flipping what we see a lot online of like endurance versus strength training in different phases. And honestly, like I did find a lot of other studies really only performed on athletes. And honestly, the conclusion of most of these studies were just like, seems like people are pretty tired when they menstruate, so maybe they should just like lift a little less. Which to me just sounds like, hey, listen to your body. And you know, before we get into my opinion on this whole thing, you also have to remember that you could probably find a study that supports your case anywhere, right? Like, obviously, I'm looking for things to help support and back this video, but really at the end of it, all of these studies that either confirm or deny any of this cycle syncing really does come down to the fact that there's not a lot of information yet. So I personally think it's really hard to form an opinion at this point. Which brings me into my conclusion. Okay, at the core of this, I do love the message. The message is, let's get you in tune with your body, how it works, and let's listen to it. As a society, I think that we are unfortunately highly uneducated about the very basics of how our body functions. So I do think that this trend is a good thing to a point. Obviously, we know there just isn't a ton of research around this yet, but more is coming. Hopefully in the future, like we continue to diversify our understanding of menstruation and training around it. My opinion is just like take it with a grain of salt. Instead of following this like verbatim, I would say like listen to your own body. But the real issue that I have with this is the lack of strength training. Like at the end of your cycle, if we pop this up here, right? You're really only able to strength train for like maybe 2 weeks or what? We'll fuck up our hormones, our bones will disintegrate. I wanna remind you of two things. Number one, strength training is low impact. Like I feel like it gets a lot of, I think that people confuse low intensity and low impact a lot. And like, you just see so much of this verbiage online of like, I stopped strength training and just did body weight Pilates. And now everything is fixed on my body because I was just, the intensity, the impact was way too high before. You have to remember that strength training is not just like deadlifting 300 pounds, right? Strength training is relative to each person because technically strength training is lifting 60% of your 1 rep max, right? Or at least that amount. But that's gonna be different for every person. Strength training could be working out with 10-pound dumbbells in your house. So you can probably still strength train in different parts of your cycle and you can just take the intensity down a bit by adjusting the weight, the reps, the sets, your rest time, like AKA listen to your body. The other point I wanna make is that the current recommendation based off of long-term studies for strength training for long-term health is about twice a week. I made a whole video about that right here. I would definitely recommend watching it. So if we're limited to like 12 days within the whole month, right? And then you're accounting for rest days, you're gonna get in like 3 strength training sessions a month. Whereas in this recommendation, if we're thinking of a month as 4 weeks, you should be getting in 8. So just saying, something to think about. I personally think that at the end of the day, we should just learn how to listen to our own bodies more rather than listening to what someone on the internet did for their body. You can absolutely use this as a template, but I would recommend that you try to make a template that works for you. I hope this video was helpful. I hope that you got to kind of see different perspectives and different viewpoints of this trend. Again, I think that there is merit to it, but I also think that people tend to take things and swing them to the extreme. If you have another trend that you would like me to dive deep into, please let me know down in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out, and I will see you all in the next one.